and it's going. Right, so hi, it's the 20th of October. This is Anthropology and the Human Condition, lecture number 6, Colonial Anthropology, Group 3, Wednesday. Okay, so today we are reading John Gledhill's great book, Power and Its Disguises, and it was written in 1994, I think, and revised in the year 2000 after he took over my course in politics at Manchester University and taught that for a couple of years and revised his work, which is, good to see. And I like this book a lot, even though I think he gets some things a bit wrong, but, you know, that's the point of having things out for debate, right? Now, he starts chapter 4. I'm launching into the middle of it because it's an interesting part, I think, although he does spend a bit of time talking about the early history of anthropology and its relationship with colonialism. But the idea that focuses the mind in chapter 4 is he starts talking about cargo cults, and we'll get into that a bit. But quickly segues into commenting on Gayatri Spivey. And the cargo cult is a phenomenon of interest to anthropology, especially since after Europeans had arrived in places like Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Islands and so on. And indigenous people there had seen how wealthy they were and how they seemed to really not do much, but then planes and boats loaded with stuff. Cargo would arrive, ice boxes and canned foods and all sorts of these goodies would come and especially a big focus in the war effort, really, related to World War II, was American soldiers arriving, setting up bases on these islands, all this cargo, boxes and boxes of stuff arriving, and the local people and natives being asked to carry it as coolies, and then getting some of it, I suppose, as reward, cans of corned beef or whatever, and then the plane stopped. And the cargo cult is like a millenarian movement that believes that the order, which had Europeans in power and Pacific Islanders and so on as servants, would be inverted, and the ancestors would send them planes full of boxes of goodies. And they wouldn't have to do anything more but march around up and down in lines like the American soldiers did, or build runways and airplanes, which they built themselves out of wood. They didn't fly, of course. Anyway, the reason for Gledhill talking about this is John Gledhill's talking about his Roger Keesing and his work on cargo cults, and addressing the issue of resistance, or the meaning of the term resistance, as something that anthropologists focused on in the context of colonialism. So something like anthropologists were not all in league with the colonizers, Malinowski arriving in the field with the police as an introduction, but looked for examples of resistance. And Keesing belonged to a movement in, I suppose, the Manchester School of anthropology was important for this. People like Max Gluckman, they were working in Africa, in the former, in the colony, what was then called, is now called Zambia, and was then called Northern Rhodesia. There was Southern Rhodesia, which is now called Zimbabwe, under Mugabe and so on. And then there was Northern Rhodesia, which is now called Zambia, was ruled, 20 years ago, a guy called Chiluba took power, 25 years ago, took power in Zambia, and it became a Christian nation. Still earlier before that, Kenneth Kaunda had been the Marxist prime minister, and I actually lived next door to him for a little while. Never saw him because he was behind a walled compound. Saw his son occasionally driving out in a nice-ish car as we walked along the road up to the market in a kind of edge of town area. Anyway, in Lusaka, this is in the capital of Zambia then. But in the Manchester school, they set up a institute for anthropology in Africa, and they studied not so much tribes and villages in the old Evans Pritchard or Malinowski tradition, but they studied the ways in which Africans were becoming wage laborers in the mines, admittedly rural, right, and in agriculture, but largely in the mines in Zambia, and they were forming trade unions effectively. So the resistance was, well, I guess you might call it trade union consciousness, and a Leninist would say you need more than that to make a real resistance. But there was some pushback against the people becoming wage laborers and subject to the exploitation and extraction of colonialism. Of course, there was always a part of that story, and many anthropologists have sought that resistance to colonialism, and historians as well, as we'll hear. And the cargo cult is sometimes characterized as a kind of resistance, a refusal of the hierarchy of colonialism, because people wanted to just receive commodities like the whites did, by sitting around all day drinking gin and tonic, and then suddenly just all this stuff would arrive on boats that they'd just hand over a piece of paper for. Right? And why wasn't that being sent by the ancestors of the Pacific Islands? So those they could also enjoy cargo. So cargo cult became religious movements where one figure prophesied that this day would come when the planes would unload whatever it was that people wanted. Now, this is a prelude that Gledhill uses to get into discussing Gayatri Spivak's work. And I'm interested in that because she's kind of my mentor in many ways. And he gets her slightly wrong. But it's good that he addresses stuff, right? So he quotes, rehearsing the old contact story can be another way of denying Europe's others a role in history, opening the chapter. So what's meant here, right? If you tell the story of colonialism, and that's the story, the only story you tell of India or the Pacific or Australia or Africa, you are kind of participating in exactly the sort of stuff we were talking about last week with Levi-Strauss, denying people their history, their own story. Now, of course, we know the victors tell the story. That old, was it Walter Benjamin or George Orwell or Winston, whoever said it? It's much debated as to who said it. What is the context story? That we shouldn't rehearse, but let's rehearse it, right? There's the first contradiction. It's that the colonialism arrived in Africa, Asia, the Americas, Columbus, right? So Europeans had previously had their kings and queens and whatever in Europe, and sometimes maybe they sailed down the coast of Africa, hugging to the coast because it wasn't safe to go out there where the monsters were. But with new technology, ship technology, and new ambitions and the drive to accumulate, as feudalism morphed into mercantile capital, they headed out at right angles to the coast of Africa, and Columbus headed to India Of course, he didn't get to India. He got to Caribbean, looking for India, thinking he'd find a passage to India. There was an overland route, Marco Polo and all of that, but it wasn't convenient. And a sailing route to India would be a great boon for the Spanish king, who had sent Columbus in 3 small ships, 534 years ago or something, 24 years. But yeah, Columbus got it wrong, and the rest is history, so to speak. But the other the other part of the context story is that Vasco da Gama, from the Portuguese sailor, went around the coast, basically a pirate and a murderer, sunk a whole boat of pilgrims going to Mecca, reaches the coast of India at Surat and sets up a trading station. And then comes Albuquerque, Alfonso de Albuquerque, who becomes the first effective Portuguese viceroy figure in India, and appeals to Sultan Mustafa for permission to build a fort in Surat and set up a trading, the beginning of a Portuguese trading empire, basically. He also travels around Southeast Asia and gets to Malacca in Malaysia. 1515, I think this is. He does some crazy things, like when Mustafa said no to having the port, he gifted him a Gujarati rhinoceros, which Albuquerque then, what do you do with a rhinoceros, sent on a boat around Africa to the Portuguese king, who promptly handed it off, or decided to send it to the Pope in Italy, although it didn't make it there. It was chained to the deck of the boat, and after stopping in just off the coast of Marseille on the island de If, being drawn by Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer heard about it and drew from copies of it. Anyway, a famous, not quite correct anatomy rhinoceros by Albrecht Dürer was drawn because the rhino was on the If for a little while. Then sailed from there and sort of drowned with his handler, which was, I think his name was Achem. Anyway, Albuquerque had been pretty ruthless as well, the Portuguese. These kind of stories are the context stories, right? And you don't hear much about Achem. You don't hear much about Sultan Mustafa. And Spivak's point, I guess, is that by focusing on that context story, you're telling the story of Vasco da Gama, the discoverer, and then the whole of British colonialism is about Clive. Clive defeats the rascal Siraj ud-Dowlah, who turns out wasn't really so rascally after all. The Black Hole of Calcutta wasn't his doing, wasn't as bad as they said it was, probably didn't even happen, it was built by the British anyway, and all sorts of, the denial of others a role in history, or even denying any kind of appearance in history, is what happens if you keep on telling this contact story of colonialism arrived and everything changed, right? The French came to Vietnam, and then there was a few battles, but basically then it was the story of basically the manufacture of opium and agricultural colonization of the lands for coffee. Now, Spivak's point is that the arrival of Europeans in those countries was not the first act, right? If you think about the theater of life, right? And Gladhill accepts this, but with a certain unease. So John Gladhill's presentation of Spivak, he uses the word berating to describe her critique of those who speak on behalf of i.e. anthropologists, speak on behalf of the indigenous, the natives. It berates them, she berates them, he says, for doing that. Whereas, how do you make that critique? Saying, you're speaking for these, you're an advocate for these others, these indigenous people, the Trobrianders or whatever, but you're the one who's, the book's published in your name, you get to speak. Where are they? How do you say that in a polite way, really, in polite company? Anyway, so Gledhill's unease with post-colonialism, I think, is part and parcel of the general anxiety that anthropology has, where it's conflicted with itself, partly because anthropologists arrive as part of the context story, and yet they want to have this be on the side of the good, of the people, of the resistance, of the, yet they've got a lot of work to do to fill in the story if contact was not the first act. And contact was not the first act, which John Gledhill does recognise. He recognises Spivak's difficult, but she offers important reflections on how any academic, including anthropologists, irrespective of nationality, can present the viewpoint of the people, subalterns is a special term for them, and make their experience known without distorting it. Think of Malinowski distorting the life of the Trobrianders, who now have to live up to that, or Evans Pritchard, not really knowing the language, talking about what Nuer are doing, but really sort of thinking metaphorically or allegorically about European nationalism in the run-up to the war. This word subalterns, a bad etymology or shorthand to think about it is subordinated and alternative perspective on the world, but it comes from Antonio Gramsci's work, an Italian Marxist who was locked up by Mussolini for many, many years and wrote these cryptic texts on smuggled bits of paper and all of this. Subaltern is a position within the army of someone who's pretty low ranked and has to follow orders, but maybe does so grumbling, right? So they have an alternative view of the orders coming down from up on high, but they have to comply pretty much. And then this metaphor of subaltern was taken out of that military context and used by the Subaltern Studies School, which Spivak joined quite late, actually. It was started by a guy called Ranajit Guha, who was an Indian sociologist historian, working in Australia for a while and India and then in Sussex, I think, in the UK. And people around him, he wrote a book called, a wonderful book called The Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency, about the resistance of the peasantry to British colonialism when it arrived in India, I suppose, a context story, but still. And it's had a very interesting methodology, which it's kind of wrong to try and sum it up in a sentence, but also can give you an idea. The historical record is written by the victors, so the British colonials, right? That's the record that we have, what they did and how they told themselves the story. But if you read through that record, you can see an entry like, for example, and I'm making this one up because just for illustration, 3,000 troops were sent on a certain date to Arcot or Jhansi, let's say. And the Subaltern Studies historian will go, oh, well, why did they go? And the text doesn't say, or they went to investigate rumors of a militant group, or the peasants, the villagers had armed themselves. And then the historian starts looking at, the subaltern historian starts looking at what few materials there are and searches for other kinds of records, letters, or oral history, or epic poems or anything to give an indication of what was going on. Why did 3,000 soldiers have to be sent to calm down a village, right? There must have been some kind of disturbance. And what was it? And why don't we tell that history? So they want to put that disturbance back into the story so they can tell the story of not the putting down of the resistance, but what the uprising was. And in one case, for example, we hear about this series of villages were sending 7 or a bunch of chapatis to each other, leavened bread. And these chapatis would circulate from village to village, and then the British were there and they were searching people or something. They'd be taking these chapatis to the next village, and they didn't understand what that was about, really, like why are chapatis being carried around. And that was sometimes a cover for smuggling weapons. Sometimes it was a message, but they didn't really understand why this was going on. So that was the disconnect, I guess, between the story they could tell, how they understood, and the local point of view. Right? So subalterns would try and subaltern historians, subaltern studies, people would try and tell this alternative story of resistance. Gledhill, when he presents resistance, is kind of more following Roger Keesing, the anthropologist, is more careful to say, it's dangerous to just think that anthropologists look for resistance too, because they kind of became a little bit obsessed with it, and then also it wasn't as organized perhaps as we might have hoped, although maybe it was and they just weren't seeing it. But Keesing says, resistance, the cargo cult style resistance is okay as a term, a concept to talk about this, so long as you see it as metaphoric or allegorical. It's not a organized resistance in the Leninist sense. So I guess there's something in that. Yeah. But what would we need to do to avoid this endless replication of the unilateral contact story? The unilateral, one-sided, Euro-teleological, tells the story of Europe in its heading in its directions. Europeans have come to basically, what we need to do to avoid endless replication is tell the story of what was happening before Europeans arrived, I suppose, and or find that story from the people themselves. And that work of bringing that into, mainstreaming that, putting that into the historical record is important and being done by many great historians working in India, for example, now. I think of Lakshmi Subramanian and Reela Mukherjee and Murali Jha and Yang and lots of people are doing this work to say, basically, I think we could shorthand it, too many shorthands here, but we could say Europeans came to Asia and Africa and the Americas, and they found in Asia an already existing and thriving economy. 1/4 of the world's wealth was, 1/4 of the world's manufacturing and value was being produced in the Greater Bengal area at the time, in the 1600s, when Europeans arrived. 5 colonial powers: the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Danish. So I guess the Portuguese weren't they were in Bengal. They were in Banda. Maybe the Spanish were not in Bengal. This wealth was there. The British came, the Europeans came with better ships and better weapons, perhaps, and they were able to take advantage of, join this thriving economy, markets and all of that existed. Relationships of production that existed, and then rip out the wealth, use it to extract wealth, and that's basically what Clive of India does. He's employed by the East India Company originally as a writer, right? So he's trained at Haileybury College by the very people that Marx was critiquing as actually Marx was critiquing them later, but the kinds of, I suppose Hailey College was later as well. He went out with the East India Company anyway as a writer to do the administrative work, the knowledge work of keeping the records for the trade, but quickly turned himself into a soldier and distinguished himself in battle, and then got a command, and then led the attack on Siraj-ud-Dowlah, fabricated the black hole story, and won Bengal for the British, basically. Forced the Emperor of India to concede that the British will be in charge of Bengal, the existing economy of Bengal, and the taxation system that they were able to then appropriate and thrive from. But yes, this is the context story, right? It's not really a one-way unilateral process, and even in the context, telling the story in a nuanced detail, we need to bring out how Clive couldn't have won the battles he won without there being intermediaries and brokers and translators and people who betrayed their national cause, if you like, for favour, the kind of what I'll call later the comprador class. Mir Jafar, for example, who betrays Siraj in particular, but others as well, and financiers and a whole range of intermediaries already existing in place as part of the market network and festival network and religious network that made that a productive zone into which Europeans could come and find something to extract, right? It can't be just a context story. There had to be something to plunder, to take away. So there must be a history, must be a story. So just repeating the context story erases that history. So, okay, the work of the Subaltern Studies school with Gramsci's concept, and then Spivey trained through translating Derrida and using deconstruction and understanding the double bind of, actually she gets that from, I guess, Du Bois, the great black sociologist from America, W.E.B. Du Bois, and his Souls of Black Folk. The idea that there were these broker in-between figures, people that were born of Africa, but taken as slaves, chattel slavery, to the Americas, and then became a part of that society. But always still today, Black Lives Matter and all of that, still today seen as somehow up against it in terms of IQ or opportunity, or they're and have perhaps internalized the double consciousness, what the white person sees and seeing what they see. When you Paul Gilroy's work is really interesting in this, the Black Atlantic as well. How that could be a creative resource, this seeing things from two different perspectives, being African and American, but also it can be a psychological battleground, I suppose. An Indian scholar called Ashish Nandi writes a book called The Intimate Enemy, which is a kind of an Indian version of the double bind that Spivey talks about as well, being stuck in a cleft stick. But in The Intimate Enemy, it's that you're of India and all of its traditions, and you're the inheritor of that, but at the same time, there's a class, and a very large number of classes have been westernized or have taken on the situation of after colonial arrival of being absorbed into the networks that include many of the ideas of Europe, literature, the sciences, psychoanalysis, psychology, Marxism, right? It's a Western thing, right? Very German philosophy. And so these are great resources, and yet they're the colonial enemy. So they're the intimate enemy. It's in your head. You're thinking in the categories of European Marxism, but resisting the Europeans. So it's a double bind in a way. And Spivey, for her later work, is really interesting on this, and her book Aesthetic Education especially explores the double bind and sees in the resources of philosophy, right? And aesthetic education is from Schiller. Sees in the resources of European philosophy the materials to then move towards emancipation or unraveling this opportunistic, grasping capitalist, colonialist system through working patiently, continually pointing out, critiquing that speaking for scenario or the repetition of the context story scenario, to teach, to learn, to unlearn the categories of projection and opportunism and individualism and so on, critically, so that without forcing anyone into seeing things another way, to encourage a habit of thinking for the benefit of all rather than for the opportunity of yourself. Right, communism, basically. Spivak's politics interrupts her prose, her theory, in ways that are always, I think, impressive and inspiring, and to me anyway, interesting, and to a great many more. And she's like heading to her 80s, still working, still traveling, writing on Du Bois. A new book will come soon, I'm assured. But her questions, going back now for many years, I think her first books are in the 70s, about colonial power and political power as a knowledge system. And it makes us ask about the relationship between these two. How the knowledge that was absorbed through education and valuing of science and methods in production, and of course the intermediaries that had to be hired by the colonial companies to enable the recruitment of local conditions and local labor into the opium factories, the indigo factories, the jute mills, the coffee plantations. This required a massive investment in knowledge of administrative knowledge, classification, surveys of people, knowledge of the population that was to be governed. The taxation system that was in place had to be turned into documentation that the Europeans, English, could manage. So knowledge in the colonial system, the great surveys and studies of geography and language and the anthropology of the subcontinent, and later it's ethnicity and diaspora, and at home ethnicity and diaspora studies, and right up to today. In order to govern, you need to know, right? So for the colonial system to work, it had to be a knowledge power economy. Colonialism integrated knowledge into its operation, and it integrated some strata of the indigenous population into that knowing. And they were the ones who were, first of all, the contact point, the translators, the brokers, the comprador class, right, who facilitate the operation of comprador. I think the term is Chinese, comes from the name of those who were hired by the opium importing companies, right? So East India Company made opium in India, shipped it on non-East India ships, but it was East India opium, shipped it on Jardine Matheson ships, traveled past Condau to Canton in China, near Hong Kong, Guangzhou now it's called, and in very strict conditions, could be sold from 10 hongs, they were called, 10 licensed shop houses could then be wholesaled into China. And each of those hongs had a comprador, a Chinese broker who was an immediate counterpoint to the opium smuggler trader, not smuggled, traded, all official and above board and so on, until the opium in the Royal Commission into opium was in 1898, right? It took a long time before they started to question the selling of this poison. The comprador figure was the Chinese broker that organized the deal for the opium seller, which would be Jardine or Matheson or one of these figures. And this comprador figure, this broker figure, was then the name for this. I don't think it even started there, but it was this kind of person that was a fixer for the companies that moved into this economy, like a translator, like a facilitator, a gomasta, as it's called in Bengal. The person who negotiated deals had a lot of power themselves as a comprador figure. And this creates a whole class, in fact. Many different fragments of that class of people who are drawn more and more into the European milieu and the education system and the knowledge system, the writing system. It's from this class eventually that the leadership of the resistance movements to colonialism come. Gandhi, for example, who was a trained lawyer, which is a person who facilitates the legal apparatus of colonialism, right? Or Mao, or even Ho Chi Minh, his father, going for the imperial exam and so on. So this class system exists, this comprador class system exists between so it's not just contact, it's not straightforward contact, there's intermediary brokers and so on. And you can ask what the subject position then of those who make a critique of colonialism is, because they've got this double consciousness, in this double bind, they're outside and inside, right? The intimate enemy of Nandi, or trade union consciousness is similar, right? A trade union is inside the workplace negotiation. It's going to defend the workers in the workplace, but it can't be against work. And trade union consciousness has to develop into something higher to be revolutionary consciousness, according to Lenin, in higher stage of imperialism and all of that stuff. It also is the class from which interest in pan-regionalism, the Bandung movement, global revolutionary movements come. They're often led by intellectuals, right? And intellectuals come from that educated, the 10% in W.B. Du Bois' view. Yeah. So national identity, double consciousness. And Gledhill talking about the creation of new classes as well. You think of the new bourgeoisie that was created in the colony, the colonial bourgeoisie, not white class of intermediaries, who sometimes expressed nationalism and or greater ideas than any of the colonists had. Gandhi, for example, when he was asked about the idea of European civilization, he said, yes, that would be a fine idea. They should go for that. Because obviously in the colonial sphere, there was no civilized behavior. Yeah, and quite a wit, Gandhi was, very, very, very witty. For someone who also was not a revolutionary, was revolutionary in a sense. Yeah, look at this picture from I don't know, just to try and illustrate the different class system. A picture from Cochin, China. Been asking you to learn to read photographs. So what do we see here? We've got on one side the we can only guess. I guess this is a farm. There's the family that owns the farm. They're sitting in comfortable chairs. They're dressed in some traditional garb, and the guy's got non-lao and something, but he's got a wonderful tash. The son is in aoyai, the wife or nanny, and the kids, quite a few kids, and they live in a house with a veranda and a roof, and so they seem fairly well-to-do, and we can guess from this photo perhaps, they employ these workers on their farm. A couple of bullocks, so quite well off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9. A couple of kids. A dozen workers, right? Who, of course, are not dressed in the same kind of garb, but rather show their muscles and their worker attire. Except for maybe the bullock controller, who's also got a shirt. The others are sweated labor, right? A couple of kids on the cart. I don't know how much we can read into this, but we don't know much more about it. We see the title, Maison d'un, a house in Cochin, China. And what is that? Motet and Chia edition, short for editions, the publisher, obviously. This is number 405 or 105, I'm not sure, of a series of postcards, I guess. There would be scenes of Cochin, China sent by the French colonists to their home countries, or by the bourgeois family to maybe some relative elsewhere. And even a postcard can show us the class system of the colonial. So this will be the comprador family. I suppose they must work with the French administration's blessing and taxation. And then there's the working class, becoming more and more a wage labor working class. I don't know if they're waged here, but probably. No longer the old bonded labor or other forms. So it's interesting how much you can see operating just in this photograph. The question of whether or not colonialism produces wage labor, well, yes, it does. It produces, it proletarianizes, it makes a laboring class as opposed to a peasantry. Not always, of course, and China and Vietnam, of course, in terms of Marxist analysis, they were peasant societies, semi-feudal, semi-colonial societies in the language of Marxism at the time. But a working class was in development, both in agriculture, industrialized agriculture, and in the factories, and very much so a wage labor economy was being introduced, to which there was resistance as well, of course. The production of proletarians, the class of workers that are disconnected from the land, that only sell their labor for a wage to the highest bidder, or to any bidder really, if you can get work. And they become a class for themselves. So in Marx's concept, the Marx and Engels concept of proletarianization, which is different to how it's taken up in contemporary cultural studies nowadays, there's also a political identity emergent from that that's very important. It's not just that they are wage laborers, but they come to know themselves as wage laborers. So all this stuff like Benedict Anderson that we've talked about in the past, about imagined communities and how that's created by newspapers and media and later radio. Gandhi doesn't become the leader of India without being able to speak to the nation on his radio show once a week. These are parts of the story, but the coming into consciousness of the proletarian class as a class is much more explicit in Marx and Engels, as that notion that these will be the agents of a resistance to the colonial. Now, there is resistance in Benedict Anderson's stuff, but it's a smaller scale resistance, more like James Scott's Weapons of the Weak. Right? But James Scott, who's well known for work in Vietnam, is not the... Well, Gledhill, for example, is quite critical of him. He favours a much more structured class analysis of resistance, and where the class learns to become part of the dynamic of struggle, in which you mix in church and bureaucracy and the party form and global solidarities and you name it what. But the anthropologists of Gledhill's type will look for these structures and advocate for that people's movement, as opposed to a kind of celebration of the weapons of the weak, the exotic cultural cuteness of their resistance, right? And there's an interesting thing why anthropologists are focused on the small scale and exotic, and then a political anthropology that moved into trade unionism and beyond, and Marxism looks for more structures, sees colonialism as a more structured kind of oppression, comes to consciousness or becomes more visible in the very period where it becomes more difficult to do that kind of it becomes easier to do exoticist anthropology. It becomes harder to do field work in the long-term sense, because there's not much time between when the anthropologists that have been collecting cultures and putting them under glass in the Anthropological Museum were soon finding it very difficult to get permission to go to do that kind of field work, because there was a resistance again. Right. So what are the assumptions and contradictions of anthropological critique? It's knowledge about society, for whom, by whom, from whom, owned by whom, measured by whom, right? These questions. Is it large structures, small structures, individual, objective, subjective? Whose knowledge system and whose authority? Whose collections, how are they gathered? I mean, I've been to galleries where you could see African art, or galleries where each piece was named, right? And it's interesting that there's such a small gap between when anthropologists were just collecting artifacts, ripping them out, saying they were advocates of the people, but taking their stuff. We looked at Michel Leary angsting about exactly that point. in the week on the Dhaka to Djibouti mission, to asking questions about what is it we're doing? Who owns culture? What's the aim of this? What's the ethics of it? Is quite a short period in a way. The collecting was soon stopped, put under glass, and the collections, well, they're still available, but they were produced for the tourism market, so they didn't get into the museum anymore that much. There really seemed to be a short amount of time from between anthropologists were collecting the artifacts of dying cultures, and then those for ethnographic museums, and then those cultures started producing those same sort of artifacts for the tourist economy. And anthropologists were finding it in that interim period, finding it very hard to go and do their fieldwork, because the countries where they had been able to do fieldwork before were the colonial occupied countries, and they'd become independent. Vietnam 45, India 47, China 49, Morocco, Tunisia 56, Malaya 57, I'm leaving some out, Ghana 57, the Cuban Revolution in 1959, they had their independence already 50 years before that, 60 years before that. Cameroon, Congo, Brazzaville, Ivory Coast, Dahomey, Gabon, Upper Volta, Madagascar, Mali, Mauritania, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Senegal on the far west coast of Africa, Chad, Togo, all these left the French Empire. In 1960, Algeria had to fight their way out in 1962 because there were so many French living there, and on and on. That's what made anthropology start to stop collecting, start to think about what it was doing. It became less easy, less simple to just simply go and do field work abroad. At least anthropologists in America found it so, and to a lesser extent Europeans. And they turned inwards at that point. They started to question themselves. What is it that we do? What have we been doing? What's the thinking, the critique of anthropology? Journals like the Critique of Anthropology started up. And they started to study their own as well, to do anthropology at home, although that we'll see is a little bit problematic. But they, by looking at what they do, they started to think about the informant. So there was the anthropological version of the broker, the comprador, the person who translated. And it's Spivak's critique of this that comes out as well. The native informant as a trope for the authentic other is something that was, she says, foreclosed before it even got into expression. The native informant became the tool of the anthropologist, although anthropologists in the 50s and 60s started to think about that and even write about their native informants, to recognize how important these brokers were in producing the knowledge that went into their system of anthropological knowledge. Books like Kevin Dwyer's Moroccan Dialogues, which is Kevin Dwyer speaking with the Fakir Muhammad in Sidi Laken, I think, a town in Morocco. A book still published under the name Kevin Dwyer, he was also head of Amnesty, called Moroccan Dialogues, but it's only one author who gets to ask the questions and adds later the footnotes and everything. Although he does include at one point, the Fakir says, but Kevin, these are all your questions. I'm only answering them because I know you're interested in this stuff. I'm not. Which is, see, the informant's role is to find out what the anthropologist wants and provide them with that. And so they're kind of like a travel tout, or they're also a trickster figure. Someone like Paul Rabinow wrote in 1978 a pretty amazing book for the time, Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco, where he started to question how these alleged truths of his fieldwork book, which is called Symbolic Domination, how those interests in symbols and so on, which were European or Harvard, Oxford, California-based questions, were relevant in the field. You can actually see him in this picture. This picture isn't good enough. Let's look at a better one. here he includes a book with the anthropologist with his informants, a bunch of men that he has tea with, although he looks pretty kind of posed and staged there. But everyone's smiling and happy. Yeah, so anthropologists, they turned inward on what they were doing themselves, thinking about what it is to have an informant, or what it is to write a book, in fact. What it is that we do, we write culture, writing culture, the writing culture debate, which was largely in the 70s with Clifford first, and then 70s, with Geertz first, and then in the 80s with Clifford, and George Marcus, maybe a more interesting writer, because he wrote later about multi-site fieldwork. They're reflecting on what is it that anthropologists do and what is it that they do. Mostly they write books. Someone said to me about my own first book, you just stare at people and then you write a book about them. It's kind of what anthropologists do, yeah? And that's pretty interesting. The other thing they did is they started, because it was difficult to go and do fieldwork in Vietnam or anywhere around the world, they started to study their own ethnic groups or minority groups or diasporas or so on. Although Vina Das makes a very good critique of that, saying the notion that the challenge to anthropology as the study of the primitive other happened with the writing culture moment, when anthropology turned to study one's own society by Western scholars, is completely ignores the fact that the study of one's own society was already a cornerstone of other anthropologies, such as those in India, China, Brazil. That's pretty interesting, because I think it's still the case that there's a two-tier system in anthropology, so that someone who's being trained in anthropology in Britain, for example, in the Malinowski tradition, where they protect that tradition, as we'll see from Keith Hart, it's the British or Americans who trained in that tradition can go and study anywhere in the world. But if you're a student from Vietnam or India or whatever, and you go to do anthropology there, the mecca of anthropology after all, where Malinowski was, pretty much you then have to do your fieldwork in your home country. I've seen it happen so many times that a student from Japan comes and wants to do fieldwork in Africa, but is told, no, you should just do it. Let's go to Osaka, or go to somewhere in Japan. And it could be the other end of Japan that they don't know or care about. It's almost like a prejudice. It's a shortcut to pass the problems with language, pass the problems with getting fieldwork access, I suppose, pass some economic issues, because you can go home and it's usually cheaper. But it's strange that the English student, they're never told only study England. The funding that allows people to go for PhDs from the Research Council is still given for English people to go out into the world, because the English state still needs knowledge coming in to run its global diplomacy, or the banks need to do country evaluations, or they call it international diplomacy now. So, there's that. And then there's the way in which a local story, this is Das, Rena Das, continuing, a local story told by a North American anthropologist or an English anthropologist becomes a universal story, whereas a local story told by an Indian or Brazilian anthropologist is merely local, right? And that's problematic. I'm quite taken by Keith Hart. He's another senior prof that I moved jobs, and they moved into my post at Anthropology at Goldsmiths. Keith Hart is pretty great. He has a view of anthropology in the 60s in Britain, that Malinowski tradition, as like a holding company of authorized individuals that can be traced to the founding fathers. And I can do that, right? My teacher was Malcolm Crick. Malcolm Crick was taught by Edward Ardner, who was taught by Wendy James, who was taught by Edmund Leach, who was taught by Malinowski. Family tree. And this is like a sales pitch or a marketing device. Come to do the Malinowski tradition, and you join the holding company. Well, that fits quite well with my idea that anthropology is only just a global conglomeration of hierarchized references, citations, publications, jobs, conferences, and a network of editing boards and departments and libraries and publishing houses and footnotes and an apparatus of knowledge. Even though I still think with Malcolm that anthropology is good still, because you can do field work. You can step out your back door wherever you are in the world and look at the way in which you live. Some people live, there are pools, there are blackberries or whatever, and find meaning about the human condition. Lightning, I'm going to have to go and shut the window. The project of field work still means going to have a look for yourself. But it has this deep political history. So what's good about it? Its defining feature, it demands intensive participant observation. You can't do it from long distance. You can't really, you need to be there physically. You need to be there to be on the shelf later. It should be for a long time, because your first impressions are nearly always wrong. And the longer you stay somewhere, the less you know of it. And you develop some kind of intimacy with the people you work with. But then you should write with them. I mean, I think that's the key. If you learn local dynamics, there's a backlash against that kind of anthropology, but that method can be modified into collective writing, collaborative writing. You can write with the informants, but of course, all too quickly as well, dialectics comes in. Collaborative work can be done without sufficient attention to the game of collaboration. Perhaps we need still more critique, but I better stop at that point, because we're spiraling into an endless vortex of criticism, and the thunder is rocking down. I don't know if you can hear that, but I have to go and shut my window anyway. We will take a break and have questions. After get to make a tea or something, I'll talk about the assessment, and we'll chat about that and look at the Gledhill